Stacey, I really will do whatever Stacey says, and it's a good path to follow in life. Just if Stacey calls and says go, just show up, and it usually works out. She asked me to talk about political entrepreneurship, and I think the best way to do that is to kind of frame out a few things, and then I'm going to stop talking and let you guys ask me any questions you want. And Michael can tell you I will pretty much answer any question you ask me, as long as you don't ask me something that will go on Facebook and end up with me losing my job. I started out as a tax attorney because I've had a fairly, I was talking with some young folks about this yesterday. When I was in college, when I was at Spelman, I worked both in the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector during college. So I worked for the Ford Foundation, I worked for Maynard Jackson at the City of Atlanta. I worked for a couple of small companies because my scholarship didn't go as far as it should have. When I went to grad school, I worked for a bank in Texas. I went to the University of Texas at Austin to do my master's in public policy. And while I was there, I worked for a community bank that was doing the first sort of the leading edge of microfinance for domestic microfinance. And did a lot of work there as we tried to figure out what that meant. When I went to law school, I ended up working in New York for a nonprofit organization that was receiving a HUD grant and had never actually put together its books. And so they were up for a $2 million grant, and it was this amazing organization that took old hotels in New York City and converted them into single resident occupancy housing using ex-offenders who had AIDS or AIDS-related complications. So these were people who were unemployable on a number of levels. And their sole premise was if you could hire them and train them, they could do work, and they would also have a place to live because they were also having difficult times securing housing in New York. The problem was these were ex-offenders who had been paid for 2 years and had never filed a tax return. And the two people who started the program, one was an excommunicated Episcopalian priest and his partner, who was a chef in New York, who had a restaurant that went out of business in 6 months because he couldn't do books. So we had a mutual friend who called me and said, "Stacey, didn't you take an accounting class in grad school?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "I need you to go to New York because they've got HUD coming to evaluate their books and to decide to give them a grant in 3 weeks." And I'm like, I didn't say I did well in the accounting class. But he was a very compelling convincer, much like Ms. Chavis over there. So I went to New York City and ended up spending 3 weeks building books for this company, but also at the same time helping these ex-offenders really understand tax policy and get their taxes filed. Because for any of them, violation of filing their taxes, if that had been discovered, could have revoked their bail or their probation, and they could have gone back to jail. And so ended up learning a lot about how nonprofits work, and because of that, decided to become a tax attorney. Because the major thing I realized was that there are a lot of folks going to tax law. Very few of them can be afforded by the people who need them most. The other thing I realized is that tax policy is considered uber complicated, and very few people want to talk about it. I'm comfortable in my nerd status and have embraced it well. And so part of what I saw my role to be when I was going forward was figuring out ways to make the complicated sound uncomplicated. Because the best way to keep people out of the political process or the economic process or any process is to make it sound impenetrable. And so one of the fundamental things I focus on is making anything I do sound doable. If you can't do it, it's not going to be because you don't understand it. And so I think the first thing about political entrepreneurship is making that your focal point. Your job is not to make things sound hard. Your job is to make hard things sound doable. If you want to understand why your population doesn't engage themselves in the political process, it's because when they begin, there's a barrier to entry and they turn around and do something that's easier. The same thing is true in business. Often, it's not a hard idea that makes $1 billion. It's an easier idea that someone made sound really complicated. I mean, Facebook aside, think about all those people who made lots and lots of money for doing simple stuff. Like the guy who created that, I know you've seen the commercial about the guy who created the drive-through car wash, that invention. I mean, he is making an absurd amount of money for something that parents used to do because they couldn't afford to take their children to Six Flags. But the idea of an invention sounds complicated. The idea of selling your idea sounds complicated. But he decided to do it anyway. It's making the complicated seem doable. You don't have to make it seem easy, but you have to make it seem doable. The second thing I learned from the work I did was that there are these things called, you learn about it in law school especially, the golden handcuffs. How many of you have heard that phrase? The golden handcuffs idea is that once you start making gold, it cuffs you to the job that gives it to you, and it's really hard to leave. When I graduated from law school, I became a tax attorney. I went to a private firm here in town, Sutherland, which is just on the other end of 10th Street. They were an amazing firm, and they paid me an absurd amount of money for knowledge that I did not possess. It was amazing. And one of the things I was very intentional about doing the entire time I was there was I never spent what I had. I lived the way I used to live when I was in Mississippi. Well, not that way, because that was really sad. But we grew up what my mother used to call genteel poor. We had no money, but we had class. And so,
I grew up the same way.
Exactly.
Mississippi house.
Exactly.
I'm not joking.
Seriously, that's exactly what you did. You may not have running water, but no one had to know that.
Exactly.
You just used the bottled water at the time because that's the way you could get it from the gas station, not because you didn't have water at your house. But for me, a big part of the job that I took, when I took my job, I drove a 2004 Chevy Cavalier when I graduated from law school in '99. So I drove a 1994 Chevy Cavalier. I upgraded to a 2001. That was my big purchase. And I rented an apartment that was nicer than the one I'd lived in before, but I didn't go out and buy a house immediately. I didn't upgrade to that nicer car because the minute you start buying the things for the lifestyle you want to live, you have a hard time leaving it behind. And so the second rule of being an entrepreneur, political or otherwise, is don't live beyond your means. In fact, live below your means. Rich people are rich because they don't spend everything they get. And that's something poor people don't have the option of learning, because usually what we've got is less than we need from the day we start. And the middle class have found sort of an equilibrium, unless of course they got caught in the housing bubble. But not living beyond your means economically, not living beyond your means politically. Don't take on things that you can't take on. Don't do things you can't do. Stacey, I think, just showed a great example of saying, when she stood here and said, I'm not going to promise you I'll get it done today. One of the worst things about an entrepreneur is when you promise a deliverable to a client and you can't provide it. If you are selling a product and you say you will have it for them in 6 weeks, and 6 weeks comes and goes and you don't have that product, so goes your purchase order and so goes your business. When you are an attorney and you promise a client that you're going to turn over a product and you don't turn it over, I promise there will be turnover within your firm. So a big part of political entrepreneurship is also when you're talking to your constituents, don't promise them things you can't deliver. A lot of my constituents will call, but I have 3 rules when they call my office. First and foremost is that we never pass them on to anybody else. My job is to find the answer for you. It is not to tell you it's not my job. So everyone who works in my office knows that they have to say, please hold on, let me get your information. I will find this information, I will call you back. Now the answer may be, I don't know anybody who can help you, but at least we're the ones who tell them that. They don't find it out from someone else. Second rule is that they have to be told within 48 hours. Within 48 hours, I can tell you I still haven't figured it out, but here's the thing. And the third is I don't promise them I can do anything. When you're listening to someone's sob story, your first gut instinct, if you are a good person, is to say, I can fix this for you. Rarely in government is that ever true. It is certainly not true if you were a state legislator. You have no power, especially if you were in the minority position. So you might be able to help, but it is a rare occasion where you can fix. And that's not your job. It feels good to say I can fix something for you. It feels better when you can say I can help you figure something out. And maybe what you help them figure out is how to live with what's wrong. But don't promise that you can fix it. So first and foremost, it's making sure that you make the hard seem doable. Second, it's don't live beyond your means. And that's your political means, your economic means, your social means. The third big rule for me of political entrepreneurship is return on investment. There are people who are going to invest in you. They're going to tell you that they think you're smart, they think you're capable, they think you're articulate, they think you're personable, they think somebody will vote for you. And they will likely give you a few bucks to make that true. I remember every person who's ever given me $1 for my campaigns. Every one of them. And I thank them all the time. The way you thank them is not only by sending them the thank you note when you get the money, it's sending them a thank you note in the middle of the session saying, thank you for helping me be here, and I'm not asking you for anything. But the largest way is by saying thank you to them by doing the job they sent you to do. I don't ever forget that people, as easily as I got in, and it wasn't that easy, I could be gone in a heartbeat. But their return on investment is when they see me doing the work that they asked me to do. They may not always agree with every single decision I make, but one of the things I do is I tell them every vote I take on every major piece of legislation. So I think Stacey gets my newsletter. I don't send out a general newsletter that sort of says, here's what's going on in the world. I send out during the session a list of bills that we have voted on, what the bill meant. So I deconstruct it, and I don't do it in a political way. It's here's what the bill says. And I said I voted yes or no, and here's why. It's great when they agree with me. It's terrible when my constituents don't agree with me, but I don't care. The point is they need to know what I've done. And what I found is that especially those who are most critical of me, the one critique they never give me is that they don't know what I'm doing. And the return on their investment is that they have a legislator, at least they know what's happening under the gold dome. And they trust me more, even when they disagree with me, to have the conversation with me. That return on investment flows further when they start telling their friends, I don't always agree with her, but I support her. Because the best way to get reelected is, well, the best way to get reelected is to do absolutely nothing so nobody notices you're there. That's probably not the way you're going to go. The second best way to get reelected is to make sure your constituents, they don't trust what you're going to do, they at least trust how you're going to think about what you're going to do. And so for me, return on investment has both a personal end and it has a political end. In business, what I've done is I have a business partner. We have 2 small companies, and I've got a 3rd company because I'm like a bad Jamaican joke from that In Living Color skit where I got like 7 jobs trying to stay here. I've got 7 jobs. I try.
Oh, tell me about your books too. I forgot to tell you you're an author. Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, that's one thing. So I've got the jobs I've got. I have a small consulting firm called Sageworks, which is a legal consulting firm, and my major client is the Atlanta Dream basketball team. So got to talk to David Stern a couple of times. It's been fun. Usually him telling me I can have whatever it is we're asking for, and you say yes sir and get on about your business. I've got a business consulting firm with a business partner, and we primarily do infrastructure development work, so helping companies that want to get involved in large, complex infrastructure projects. We have a small bottled water company for babies and toddlers, and I write novels on the side. So those are my businesses, all of which amass together to pay my card note, if not buy me a whole new car. So it's good. But the return on investment with my business partner is this for her. We work together. I never promise her things I can't do. So during the session, she knows that I am gone for 3 months. I will only do work that can be done between 7 p.m. and 2 a.m. So I don't go to meetings. Don't promise I can show up for those. Especially with my new job, going to meetings that are not related to the legislature will be nearly impossible. But the trust that I have with her is a big return on investment, because what she knows is that if I tell her I get something done, I'll get it done. But that lets her give me the freedom to do the other work I need to do. And if I can't get it done, I tell her that too. We have to take fewer clients during the time I'm in session. But what we get instead is a higher quality of client each time we're back out. Now I refuse to engage in any political work in Georgia. So we don't have clients who use our services here that are based here in Georgia that need to get access to government, because I don't leverage that. It's the easiest way to use your job. And any political job you have, the easiest part of your job is selling the access that you have. Resist that as much as possible, because the return on investment for that one is negative. It may be financially beneficial to begin with, but going to prison is never fun. And most people do not look that good in orange, except for that young lady over there. But orange is not a good color on most people. And when you start selling access, and it just starts off with, well, can you introduce me and I'll give you a retainer. When that's how you begin, that's how you get in trouble. We've got one client who is actually engaged in a project with the state, and I'm walled off from that project. I don't go to meetings. I don't have any connection to them at all. We have a memo that's into the Attorney General so that if it ever comes up, it's very clear that I didn't do it and it wasn't a part of it. Plus, if this administration decides to work with my client or with our company's client, it will not be because they like me. So I'm more of a hindrance than a help. But the point is, the return on investment goes both ways. You can have negative ROI or positive ROI. And the negative ROI is when you use your access to bolster your bottom line. Because at that point, you're no longer focusing on who your bottom line should be. And while it may be financially successful, overall it can be very detrimental, and it follows you. There's not a mistake you make in politics that somebody doesn't remember and remind you about. And you can sometimes overcome it and still, achieve high office. But those are stories that we remember because they're unusual, not because they're the norm. So again, make the easy or make the hard seem understandable. Absolutely, positively, don't live beyond your means, and absolutely follow and make sure that you've got strong ROI. And those are my 3 tips, and I'll stop talking.